Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Anjali Daimari from the Department of English, Guwahati University. What we will be doing now is paper 13, module 33, South Asia, and the region that we'll do is Afghanistan. In this module, you will be expected to have some knowledge about the politics of the region. This module will also allow you to look at Afghanistan and the way war has impacted the women. Afghanistan has witnessed more than 3 decades of wars and internal conflicts. The Soviet occupation 1979 to 1989, period of tribal civil wars 1990 to 1996, and the oppressive rule of the Taliban 1996 to 2001 have radically changed a society which had a comparatively progressive attitude towards women and equality. Afghan women were first given the vote in 1919, only a year after women in Britain, and the country's first constitution in 1923 guaranteed equal rights for both men and women. The strict dress code enforced in much of modern-day Afghanistan was non-existent for much of the 20th century, and even female members of the royal family appeared in public without veils. As a girl, I remember my mother wearing miniskirts and taking us to cinema, and my aunt went to university, says Amnesty International researcher Horia Mozadik, who was a young girl living in Kabul when Russia invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Now, I have before you a brief timeline of conflicts and their impact on women. Ever since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the country has turned into a battlefield for various stakeholders. The subsequent war, 1979 to 1989, stands out in particular as a lasting legacy of the Cold War. It continues to plague international society in the current struggle between the Western liberal democratic order and Islamic extremism. Scholars in international relations claim that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was driven by security concerns. A rapidly weakening Afghanistan, vulnerable to Islamic extremism and the threat of Western encroachment posed to the Soviet Union's southern borders. To counter the communist bloc, Taliban, a group of religious students leading a holy war or jihad, one of the Mujahideen groups, was formed. The Mujahideens were backed by external forces like the US, Saudi Arabia and China, and operated out of Pakistani safe havens. A civil war that broke out soon after led to massive human rights violations and displacement, altering the limited progress towards gender equality in the 1970s under President Daud Khan's government, leading the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, that prior to April 1978 communist coup had brought some reforms for women empowerment in the country. As the civil war was intensified, 6 million people had fled the country by the end of 1980s, taking refuge in neighboring Iran and Pakistan, and millions more were internally displaced. Besides, the rival Mujahideen militias and aligned criminal groups attacked and looted the civilian population. Women were abducted, sold, raped, or kept as sex slaves. A human rights activist and head of a local NGO in Mazar-e-Sharif said, and I quote, "Left-wing feminist movements were attacked ideologically and their members physically abused by both the communist regime and the Mujahideen, unquote. In rural Afghanistan, women couldn't be provided with adequate health care, education, and other services. Afghan women got involved with NGOs that looked into various women's issues linked to survival and livelihood. However, the Mujahideen attacked NGOs that employed Afghan women. In April 1988, Afghanistan and Pakistan signed the Geneva Accords with US and USSR acting as guarantors, which marked the withdrawal of Soviet troops and attempted to establish a political settlement between the Mujahideen and the PDPA regime.
I've just received a briefing from my national security advisors on the contents of the proposed Geneva agreements on Afghanistan that would provide for the complete withdrawal of Soviet occupation forces from that country. I believe the U.S. can now join the Soviet Union as a guarantor of the Geneva instruments. This development would not have been possible had it not been for the valiant struggle of the Afghan people to rid their country of foreign occupation. We take great pride in having assisted the Afghan people in this triumph, and they can count on our continued support.
I do believe those are important questions that deserve very careful consideration.
Does that mean you're ready to pull out of Afghanistan?
Означает ли это, что вы готовы уйти из Афганистана?
Ну, это о том, что мы готовы уйти из Афганистана, я уже сказал давно.
The fact that we are ready to withdraw from Afghanistan is something that I have said some time ago.
А вот мы поговорим в конкретном уже плане.
So what we are going to discuss will be more specific.
The withdrawal of Soviet forces ignited a fight over power and position between Pakistan and Mujahideen, the parties that together weakened the PDPA regime. Human rights groups reported cases of women committing suicide or parents killing their daughters to prevent them from being subjected to sexual violence. In 1992, Kabul was captured by the Mujahideen, but by 1994 in Kandahar, Pakistan-backed Taliban movement brought in new power dynamics, affecting the lives of women tremendously.
The Taliban is a group in Afghanistan that follows fundamentalist Islamic teachings, practiced through the prism of Pashtunwali, an ethical code and lifestyle that predates Islam. After the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which began in December 1979 and ended in early 1989, the Mujahideen there, a collection of loosely aligned groups who had collectively fought the Soviet occupation, did not form a coercive, united government, and instead fought each other for territory and resources. The Taliban movement itself may have begun in the early 1990s, but emerged as a credible militant force as an alternative faction in a multi-sided civil war in 1994 under Mullah Mohammed Omar, and offered a hopeful alternative for Afghanis in comparison to the feudalistic fighting conducted by the Mujahideen, with at least some considerable backing from the Pakistani intelligence services, who, among other things, wished to stabilize the region. In September of that year, the Taliban took control of Kandahar, which had until then been lawless and an extremely dangerous place for its citizens. Although they suffered significant defeats before attempting to wrestle Kabul from government forces, Taliban numbers and equipment were bolstered by funding from sources within Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and possibly by previous streams from the American Central Intelligence Agency. On the 27th of September, the Taliban seized Kabul, with much of the government's forces withdrawing to the country's south rather than engaging in street fighting. On that same day, Omar became the head of the Supreme Council of Afghanistan, and from then until the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban led a government that followed strict interpretations of Sharia law, and even though civil conflict continued, ruled much of the country. After sheltering members of Al-Qaeda, they were pushed out of office by foreign intervention in late 2001. However, they currently remain an active insurgent militia across various places of Afghanistan.
Women soon became the victims of Taliban governance, which was based on orthodoxy. Women had to wear burqa and men were required to grow beards. Music, television and internet were banned in the country as these were considered to be Western products. Girls' education was denied and their schools were closed down. Women had no right to seek employment and were prohibited to go outside without a male relative. Talibanization of the country adversely affected the lives of the Afghan womenfolk. Militants continue to visualize women empowerment as a Western concept. Taliban is also putting no emphasis on the inclusion of women in the peace process. Afghanistan is yet to implement an action plan under the rulings of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. In 2001, the Bonn Agreement was agreed upon by United Nations, NATO, neighboring Iran and Pakistan, and almost all important Afghan stakeholders, excluding Taliban, to ensure women's participation in rebuilding Afghanistan's institutions and government. Post 9/11 US attacks, US launched Operation Enduring Freedom against the main suspects of the attack, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime of Afghanistan, as part of its global war on terror. In March 2003, the Afghan government under Hamid Karzai ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. As a result, women activists had some leverage to demand women's rights towards their participation in public space. Approved in January 2004, the Constitution gave equal voting rights to Afghan women and called for the establishment of Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission to monitor any gender-based discrimination. The aftermath of the Bonn Agreement also saw reservation of seats for women in Parliament. In 2008, the government enacted the National Action Plan for the Women of Afghanistan for implementing the promises made on women's empowerment over a 10-year period till 2018. Meanwhile, the Taliban forces continue to impose their irrational rulings upon the women. Laws were there, but only on paper. The international community used women as an entry point into the country. They said they were here to protect women's rights, said Asila Wardeg, Director of Human Rights and Women's International Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Just before the presidential elections in 2014, the international forces were withdrawn, bringing in opportunities for the militants and new challenges for the women. The transition process, where international troops have been withdrawn from Afghanistan in a phased manner, have created fresh doubts about the security and rights of women. In the High Peace Council set up by the Afghan government, there are only 9 women members out of a total of 79. There are negotiations going on with the Taliban, but no one knows in reality what is going on. It is an underground process. Women are the victims and everyone is playing with their future. Dr. Soraya Sobrang, Commissioner, Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, comments. The wars in Afghanistan have left thousands of men dead and missing. There is no accurate count available. However, Afghanistan has one of the highest numbers of widows proportionate to the total population in the world, a result of decades of conflict. According to Deborah Zalin, a board member of the Beyond 9/11 and a law professor at the City University of New York, the average age of an Afghan widow is just 35 years and 94% of them are unable to read and write. About 90% of Afghan widows have children and the average widow has more than 4. Given the nature of Afghan society, where women are largely uneducated and where a widow is perceived to be a sign of ill omen and a harbinger of bad luck, their plight is definitely difficult to imagine. They have to bring up children and with no source of income. More often than not, their homes have been destroyed. Widows of soldiers, policemen, and government employees are entitled to a regular pension. Their numbers are small compared to widows of civilians who get only 5,000 Afghanis a month. Since the women are uneducated, they often do not know how to claim the regular stipend they are entitled to and instead receive a one-time payment. The majority of women in Afghanistan depended on their husbands or other male members of their families. Widows are left penniless and powerless and often have to take to begging, since no other options are available to them to sustain themselves and also sustain their families. Paula Bronstein of the National Geographic magazine, who studied and photographed the widows of Afghanistan, says that there are approximately 50,000 to 70,000 of our widows living in Kabul alone. Widows are one of the casualties of war, but their stories are seldom heard nor are they recorded. Widowed women are also at greater risk of emotional problems and impaired psychosocial functioning than either married women or men, typically because of social exclusion, forced marriages, gender-based violence, and lack of economic educational opportunities, says Zalin. In Afghanistan's patriarchal society, the death of a husband not only diminishes a woman's economic independence, but also damages her sense of social protection, says Hussein Ali Moin, an official at MOWA. Now let us look into the various ways in which women fight back. In the decades that Afghanistan has experienced war and bloodshed, women have been raped, humiliated, driven to beg on the streets, forced to cover themselves, confined to their homes, not allowed to work. The list is endless. Women, however, have survived. They have supported each other, written poems, and overcome almost insurmountable odds. A hill in eastern Kabul is home to a unique community. Over the past 2 decades, widows have converged there, finding strength in each other's company. Bibi Aisha is among its oldest residents. Her husband belonged to a fiercely anti-Taliban community and was shot dead by a Taliban patrol party in the late 1990s. After his death, Bibi Aisha began to work, first as a cleaner and then in a textile factory. But she struggled to make enough money to rent a big house, big enough for her and her 5 children. A decade ago, she decided to build a house on an unclaimed patch of land, 1 mud brick at a time. More squatters followed. I told women who didn't have a house, come here and build one yourself. God will help you. You don't need other people's help, said Bibi Aisha, sitting in the house she built. Eliza Griswold, in April 27, 2012, wrote, and I quote, "Why Afghan women risk death to write poetry," where she describes the activities of a women's literary society, Mirman Bahir, based in Kabul. Members from the rural areas phone in to recite their poems. In a society which is rigidly patriarchal, and any action which is seen as defying tradition can even lead to a woman being killed or forced to commit suicide. Meena lost her fiancé in a hand mine explosion. According to Pashtun tradition, she will be forced to marry one of his brothers. Her only form of protest is to recite poetry. When asked about how old she was, Meena responded in a proverb, and I quote, "I'm like a tulip in the desert. I die before I open, and the waves of desert breeze blow my petals away," unquote. She wasn't sure of her age, but thought she was 17. "Because I am a girl, no one knows my birthday." Let us now discuss displacement and life for Afghan women. Prolonged conflicts in Afghanistan have led to people fleeing their country and living as refugees in neighboring countries. There is also the problem of a large number of internally displaced people living in prison-like conditions in camps in urban areas of Afghanistan. Women are extremely vulnerable when they live in camps. They are not allowed to go out to work. Their problems are compounded by the fact that their traditional means of livelihood, which were farming and rearing of livestock, are no longer available options in urban settings. Women who have been separated from their husbands or are widows are often forced to beg to sustain themselves and their children. They also face sexual abuse. Even they do not have access to education and health care. Taliban restrictions and mistreatment of women include ban on women appearing on the balconies of their apartments or of any kind. 2. Ban on women playing sports or entering a sports center or club. 3. Ban on women riding bicycles or motorcycles even with their mahrams. 4. Ban on women's wearing brightly colored clothes. In Taliban terms, these are sexually attracting colors. Number 5. Ban on women gathering for festive occasions such as the Eids or for any recreational purpose. 6. Ban on women washing clothes next to rivers or in a public place. 7. Modification of all place names including the word women. For example, Women's Garden has been renamed Spring Garden. 8. Complete ban on women's work outside the home, which also applies to female teachers, engineers, and most professionals. Only a few female doctors and nurses are allowed to work in some hospitals in Kabul. 9. Complete ban on women's activity outside the home unless accompanied by a mahram, close male relatives such as father, brother, or husband. 10. Ban on women dealing with male shopkeepers. 11. Ban on women being treated by male doctors. 12. Ban on women studying at schools, universities, or any other educational institution. Taliban have converted girls' schools into religious seminaries. 13. Requirement that women wear a long veil, burqa, which covers them from head to toe. 14. Whipping, beating and verbal abuse of women not clothed in accordance with Taliban rules or of women unaccompanied by a mahram. 15. Whipping of women in public for having non-covered ankles. 16. Public stoning of women accused of having sex outside marriage. A number of lovers, in fact, are stoned to death under this rule. 17. Ban on the use of cosmetics. Many women with painted nails have had fingers cut off. 18. Ban on women talking or shaking hands with non-mahram males. 19. Ban on women laughing loudly. No stranger should hear a woman's voice. 20. Ban on women wearing high-heeled shoes which would produce sound while walking. A man must not hear a woman's footsteps. 21. Ban on women riding in a taxi without a mahram. 22. Ban on women's presence in radio, television or public gatherings, houses. 23. Compulsory painting of all windows so women cannot be seen from outside their homes. 24. Ban on male tailors taking measurements or sewing women's clothes. 25. Ban on female public baths. 26. Ban on males and females traveling on the same bus. Public buses have now been designated males only or females only. 27. Ban on flared wide pant legs even under a burqa. 28. Ban on the photographing or filming of women. 29. Ban on women's pictures printed in newspapers and books or hung on the walls of houses and shops. So in sum, it can be said that Afghanistan is one of the worst places to be a woman. In conclusion, it can be said that Afghanistan is the second worst country in the world to be a mother. One woman in 11 dies in pregnancy or childbirth in Afghanistan. In Australia, the risk of maternal death is less than 1 in 7,400. 87% of women in Afghanistan experience domestic violence. 13% of females over 15 years old are literate compared to 43% of males. Almost double the number of boys compared to girls are enrolled in school. The average Afghan woman won't live to see her 50th birthday. In Australia, female life expectancy comparatively is 84 years. Afghan women earn 25 cents or less for every dollar men earn. 27% of parliamentary seats are held by women. Only 16% of peace agreements in the last 2 decades have contained a reference to women and gender. According to local reports from mid-2012 to early 2013, 30 female political and civil society leaders have been killed. Female political candidates are the target of 90% of all threats against candidates in Afghanistan. Targeted attacks on civilian women and children as they go to work or school have increased by 20% in 2012 compared to in 2011. It is said that you can't be an active woman in Afghanistan and not feel threatened. It is part of one's daily life. And as someone has said, I never know what is going to happen next. In the last 5 years, many high-profile Afghan women have been killed for trying to raise the profile of women or defend their human rights. And as someone said, I take one day at a time, but try to work on issues that will have a lasting effect. Thank you.